everyone, if you want to see the first episode of my new series called Bfdi Challenges, raise your hand. Now that that's settled, let's see the first contest. First up, Spongy versus Paper. Spongy wins. Next up, Anchor versus OJ. Go. Anchor wins. Next up, VHSE versus Sky. VHSE, you are not able to defeat me, the incredible Sky. VHSE wins. Screw you, VHSE. Next up, Bozo versus Salt Lamp. Go. Bozo wins. Next up, Boombox versus Fries. Go. Fries wins. Next up, Pencil versus CRT. Go. CRT wins. Next up, this might be a shocker to you because you're not going to say no. These two characters can't fight. They're best friends. But Sai, the next challenge is going to be against Loser and Cake. Oh no, I can't defeat my buddy Cake. Sorry, Loser. I know you're friends and all, but I will destroy you. Cake wins. Next up, Snare Drum versus Puffball. Puffball wins. Next up, Pin versus Candy Corn. Go. Pin wins. Next up, Light versus 9Ball. Go. 9Ball wins. Next up, Purple Face versus Skeleton. Gulp. Purple Face wins. Next up, Cheesy versus Evil Fiery. Evil Fiery wins. Next up, Human versus Bolly. Human wins. Next up, Profile versus Asteroid. Asteroid wins. Next up, Grassy versus Bell. Bell wins. Next up, Pen versus David. Oh, seriously? David wins. Next up, Woody versus TV. TV wins. Yay! Next up, Bracelety versus Snowball. Bracelety wins. Next up, Black Hole versus Clock. Black Hole wins. Next up, Waffle versus Queenie. Queenie wins. Next up, Nickel versus Foldy. Foldy wins. Next up, Rocky versus Baseball. Baseball wins. Next up, Pie versus Blender. Blender wins. Next up, Battery versus Example Contestant. Example contestant wins. Next up, Ice Cube versus Fiery Jr. Fiery Jr. wins. Next up, Naily versus Needle. Needle wins. Next up, Pillow versus Yellowface. Bye. Yellowface wins. Next up, PDA versus Book. Book wins. Next up, Bubble versus Bus. Bus wins. Next up, Bonnie versus Tree. Tree, you're in my views. Tree wins. Next up, Basketball versus Stapy. Stapy wins. Next up, Non-Existy versus Non-Existy Sister. Non-Existy Sister wins. Next up, Steamy versus Bottle. Bottle wins. Next up, Dirt Cake versus Lollipop. Lollipop wins. Next up, Rope Body versus ITRD. ITRD wins. Next up, Avocado versus Slop and Cart. Slop and Cart wins. Next up, Evil Leafy versus Rubber Spatula. Evil Leafy wins. Next up, Fiery versus Leafy. Fiery wins. Next up, Rusty Coin versus Origami. Origami wins. Next up, David Clone versus Smassy. Smassy wins. Next up, Evil Grassy versus Lego Brick. Go. Evil Grassy wins. Next up, Disky versus Lightning. Lightning wins. Next up, Fist Monster versus Boom Mike. Fist Monster wins. Next up, Me Phone versus Remote. Remote wins. Next up, Marshmallow versus Scissors. Cut. Scissors wins. Next up, Joystick versus Evil Bubble. Evil Bubble wins. Next up, Clapboard versus Tape. Clap, 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 clap. Clapboard wins. Next up, Toon versus Red Velvet Cake. Red Velvet Cake wins. Next up, Shampoo versus Invisible Coiny. Invisible Coiny wins. Next up, Eggy versus Taco. Taco wins. Next up, Barf Bag versus Eraser. Barf Bag wins. Next up, Football versus Teardrop. Teardrop wins. Next up, Jack and Jellyfy Member versus Console. Console wins. Next up, tennis ball versus Balloony. Balloony wins. Next up, donut versus robot flower. Robot flower wins. Next up, Dora versus paintbrush. Paintbrush wins. Next up, Cloudy versus Blocky. Blocky wins. Next up, Fish versus Gatey. Gatey wins. Next up, Saw versus Marble. Oh, I'm so going to defeat you, Marble. Saw wins. Next up, Ruby versus Camera. Camera wins. Next up, Flower versus Leek. Leek wins. Next up, Mask versus Price Tag. Price Tag wins. Next up, Kitchen Sink versus Bug. Bug wins. Next up, Clip versus 8-Ball. 8-Ball wins. Next up, Golf Ball versus Fanny. I hate you, Bossy Bot Golf Ball. Fanny wins. Final three is Marker versus Max versus Winner. Winner wins. Next episode will be released on April 1st, 2021. It's going to be called Rock, Paper, Scissors, Shoot, because we're going to have 3 contestants. And the characters, Rocky, Scissors, and Paper, will win. If Rocky, Scissors, or Paper survive the elimination next month. And also, Bfdi 30 is coming out 9 days after my new video. So make sure to watch it. Subscribe to Jack and Liffy, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Anyway, announcer out!